Mick, thank you. Appreciate the chance to come and do part 2 of this, connecting Sunday and Monday, what every pastor needs to know about work and economics. Previously, we've said from last week that this is relevant both for Talbot students who are preparing for pastoral ministry, because the lion's share of the people that you will minister to in the local church and on the mission field are in the marketplace making a living. And this is also important for those of you who are undergrads, and I know there's a significant number of you here who are undergrads, because as you think about the areas that God is calling you to, what are the areas in which your gifts and skills and talents can be best used in the way God has wired you? What you need to hear is that the areas of the marketplace are also areas of sacred calling and areas of service to Christ. So what we said last time was that all of our work in the marketplace, all legitimate work in the marketplace, is an arena of service to Christ, where the very work itself is a significant part of what constitutes a person's service to Christ. We recognize that work was ordained in Genesis 2, not Genesis 3, and is a significant part of what it means for human beings to exercise dominion over the world. But we also suggested that the most significant reason theologically why our work has intrinsic value in service to Christ is because that's fundamentally who God is. Not the whole, but a part of who God is, and a big part of what it means to be made in His image. So that, as Chuck Colson put it, we are hardwired for work as part of our spiritual DNA, and that therefore our work is part of our service to Christ and therefore our ministry. And we said that the term for service and ministry, the Greek term diakonia, is translated in both of those ways. And so this is why, for example, when you walk into the business school, you'll see the banner that comes down that says business as ministry. And recognizing that God calls people to business and to the professions and to blue-collar work in the same way analogous that He calls men and women to the pastorate and to the mission field, and that there is no hierarchy in that regard. Now, if that's true, and if the way we talk about this begins actually to reflect our theology of work, where we don't talk about people going into, quote, full-time ministry when they decide to get a paycheck from a church or Christian organization, we recognize that all followers of Christ go into full-time service for the King at the moment they come to faith. And the decision about what they will do for their occupational part of their vocation is a different decision, but really has nothing to do with whether they are in full-time service of the King or not. Now, if all of that's true, then what we also suggested is that what God calls people to in the marketplace also has eternal significance. It's analogous to the way God calls people to the work of God in the pastorate or in the mission field. The marketplace is also a place where God calls people to His work in the world, and therefore gives it eternal significance. Now, part of the question, if that's what the Bible teaches, and I think it's pretty clear that that's indeed what it does teach, then the question that I find myself wrestling with is, how did we deviate so far from that today, where we have business and professional folks in our churches that often feel like they are second-class citizens when it comes to serving Christ, and that they have this sense that it's only the people who are getting a paycheck from a church or Christian organization who are on the front lines of service or who are doing something really spiritually meaningful with their lives. And we hear all the time people who suggest that I've got to leave my business in order to really do something that counts for God's kingdom. So what I want to explore today is, how did we get to this place where we have this hierarchy of callings, where at the top of the pile seem to be people who are headed for the mission field or the local church, and then it's business and professional folks that are quite a bit farther down the ladder. When my son was a film student here, he actually found out that it was the film students who tended to be at the bottom of the hierarchy because they were headed for Hollywood. But what I want to do just is think for a few minutes about, what happened to the biblical teaching on this, and how did we end up in this place where we are today? Well, it grieves me to say this, but as the chair of the philosophy program, and as these lectures being sponsored by the philosophy department, some of this actually started with a philosopher, of all things. Now, again, it pains me to say that, but I think a significant, it's hard to pinpoint exactly where this started, but a significant impetus to this dichotomy between the marketplace and, quote, the ministry was actually begun by Aristotle, where he distinguished between what he called the active life and the contemplative life. And the active life included all of those things that the average person did to make a living, and those things were strictly a means to an end so that you had the time, energy, and resources to pursue the higher good, which in his view was what he called the contemplative life. And in fact, Aristotle held that giving attention to that part of life actually enabled a person to fulfill their highest good and their highest purpose. Now, that contributed, it was one of a handful of factors that contributed to a widespread skepticism in the ancient world about the place of business and commerce and economics, because it was resigned to that active life that was strictly a means to an end. Now, I think another part of this actually that contributed to a general skepticism about commerce and business had to do with the immoral means that were generally the case in the ancient world by which wealth was accumulated. Economic life in the ancient world resembled what we call a zero-sum arrangement, where if you think about it as a pie, where the size of the pie is fixed, and if somebody got a bigger slice of the pie, that meant somebody else, by definition, got a smaller one. And in the ancient world, it was actually very common. In fact, most people in the ancient world who achieved wealth did so at the expense of somebody else, either by theft or extortion or some misuse of a position of power. This is why in the ancient world, overwhelmingly, the wealthiest people were also the ones who were the most politically connected and had the chance to misuse that power. This is also the reason why the prophets spoke out so clearly and so often against those who would oppress the poor and take advantage of them. The idea that you could do well financially and do good at the same time was a concept that was largely foreign in the ancient world. Though there were, to be fair, there were some examples of people who were quite wealthy just through the conduct of their business. But they were the exception and not the rule. Most people who got wealthy did so by clearly immoral means, which I think is one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why Jesus could say that it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Yes, there's a lot of things, there was intrinsically the temptation to idolatry that came with wealth, but I think most commonly the problem with the accumulation of wealth was the means by which it was accumulated. And that more often than not, that involved severe faith-compromising activity in order to accumulate wealth. So eventually, and this is sort of fast forward a few hundred years, but eventually these, I think, two trends came together to create what I think came to be a very stark hierarchy in the medieval world between priests, nuns, and monks who had callings, who were clearly at the top of the pile, and everybody else who, for the most part, were the slugs that had jobs that their role was to either support themselves or support those who were cloistered in monasteries. Now, to be fair, it is true that there were a number of monasteries that were also very successful businesses. and supported themselves in that way. But the problem with this hierarchy went significantly deeper, and eventually this is what aroused the ire of Luther and Calvin and the Reformers. And that is that by being a priest, nun, or a monk and being cloistered either in a monastery or in a parish priesthood, those men and women who occupied those roles had more time and energy to devote themselves to the good works that theologically at that time were taught that were necessary to merit one's salvation. And so being a priest, nun, or a monk, having those higher callings was actually seen as moving you much farther down the road toward meriting your salvation than the average person who had to spend all of their time and energy making a living and supporting their dependents. And so this eventually, I think, is what really got the attention of the Reformers. And so when Luther and Calvin and others came on the scene preaching that you are justified by faith alone, and that all believers are part of a royal priesthood, the idea of the priesthood of all believers. The idea was that you did not have to be cloistered in order to have a legitimate calling from God. And that Luther and Calvin and others, they coined the term that you could have, there now was such a thing as a worldly calling. And that your vocation, what God was calling you to do, could actually be worked out in the marketplace, in the real world, as opposed to being cloistered away in separation from that. And the Reformers had a number of very colorful ways to describe this. Luther especially had a handful of very, very descriptive ways that he put this. My favorite was when he said this. He said, even the hangman brings honor to God if he does his work well. Right? Now, I recognize that presumes a certain view of the death penalty. But Calvin echoed this, where, as he put it, the whole world is a theater of God's glory. And as Calvin put it, he said, even politics, though I'm not sure he'd been in California, even politics is an arena in which God could be honored. Right? But it went a little bit deeper than that, because the ideas of justification by faith and the priesthood of all believers actually drove a stake right into the heart of this medieval hierarchy. Because those two doctrines made it very clear that nobody's works, whether it was in the marketplace or the monastery, had any value to God in terms of meriting your salvation. And so that there was no sense that anybody had a higher calling, because all of our works to merit God's favor were all on the same level playing field, generating nothing for us. In fact, as Luther put it, God doesn't need our good works. But he did say that our neighbor does. And our good works function not, according to Luther, not to impress God, but to be the way in which we love our neighbor. And so church work, clerical work, being in the monastery, was not considered in any way superior to what the average person was doing in the marketplace. In fact, I think, I can't quote Luther on this, but I think he would have said something like this, that changing a diaper is just as holy as teaching a child a Sunday school lesson. You know, correct me if I'm wrong on that citation. But you could put it a different way, where we'd say in a university setting that teaching physics or teaching metaphysics, you had to throw that in there, is just as holy as teaching the Bible or theology. In fact, when I first started teaching here, longer ago than I prefer to admit, I started in the Department of Bible Exposition and was there for 3 or 4 years while I was finishing my doctoral work in ethics and transitioning into that field. And when the transition was complete, I had more than a handful of students who came up to me, and with a sort of a concerned look on their face, they said, well, how come you're not teaching the Bible anymore? And I said, well, thank you for bringing that to my attention, because I wasn't aware that I had stopped. I was just applying the biblical teaching in some more very specific ways. But I think in their minds, what I was doing now in ethics was not quite as good as what I'd been doing when I was teaching in Bible exposition. When in reality, I was actually doing exactly the same thing, just in a little different arena. Now, I do think that Luther sort of inadvertently may have demolished one hierarchy, but sown the seeds for recreating it later on. Because Luther also viewed the world through the idea of the two kingdoms. There's a spiritual kingdom, which is the realm of the church, and the earthly kingdom, which was the realm of civil government, essentially. But he placed what goes on in the marketplace in the realm of the earthly kingdom. Another way to put this is he called this the spiritual, the world of the church was the right hand of God as opposed to the left hand of God. And by relegating what goes on in the marketplace to this earthly kingdom, and granted, denying that it had any spiritual significance in terms of meriting our salvation, I think that got translated inadvertently to this idea that what went on in the marketplace had no spiritual significance. Now, so fast forward again, and with our tradition, if you've had some church history, of evangelical pietism, we ratcheted up this hierarchy again, it seems to me. And by the focus of the pietistic movement was to concentrate on our own personal devotion to Christ, our own sense of personal piety, and place great emphasis on the preaching of the gospel and on your own personal time with God, your own personal study of the Bible and teaching the Bible. And I think inadvertently downplayed everything else that they didn't consider was a part of advancing our own sense of personal piety. And I think that the danger that arose from that over the centuries was that we essentially recreated the medieval dichotomy between the monastery and the marketplace. Only church work in the mission field replaced the monastery. And the goal was not to merit salvation, but the goal was to do something that had eternal significance to it. And I think we have misapplied the very common phrase when we say the only two things that last forever are the Word of God and the souls of human beings. And we assume that therefore the only things that have eternal significance are those things that invest in those two areas. Okay? But as we saw last time, that's way too reductionistic a view of what counts for having eternal significance. And it seems to me that the idea of doing things that have a consequence for eternity has replaced doing things that merit our salvation as the goal of this hierarchy. So now, to be sure, I think we can say that there are some ways in which, for those of you that are wired and gifted and have a sense of calling to be pastors or to be missionaries, that there is a sense in which that is a better calling. Right? But I mean that in a subjective way. That it is better for you to pursue that, because that's the thing that's most consistent with how God's wired you and what your gifts and skills and talents and passions are leading you toward. But I don't think we can say that there's any sense that it is better in an objective sense. And this is, I think, where the hierarchy starts to set in again. And let me just, if I could just take a brief parenthesis and talk to you who come from churches of Asian descent. We have Talbot students who are ministering in churches that are Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. Or those of you undergrads who have come to Biola and maybe still attend churches that are from Asian ethnicities. My experience in working with Talbot students in particular is that the hierarchy in some of these Asian contexts is much more pronounced. And that the pastorate and the mission field are viewed as the highest callings, more of in an absolute sense, which leaves the business professional marketplace person feeling like about the only thing they are good for in terms of God's kingdom is generating the revenue that's needed to support the people who are really on the front lines. And I think those of you that come out of those contexts, I think have a much more uphill battle in integrating what I think is the biblical teaching on this into your lives and how you see your work, how you see the careers that you're pursuing, and how you see the pastorate and the mission field. And I think not only in Asian context, but I think in some cases, this hierarchy actually has a substantial bit of ego involved too. And that in some cases, I think actually this hierarchy is an expression of some narcissistic tendencies among our brothers and sisters. And that grieves me to see those things masquerading under what I think is an inadequate theological view of what it means to have a calling and a vocation to the marketplace as well as to the pastorate or to the mission field. Now, I understand that this has really deep cultural roots too, but I would encourage you to think outside of some of these cultural things that I think give aid and comfort to a hierarchy that I think is a profoundly unbiblical view of the way we treat the pastorate, the mission field, and the marketplace. And as a seminary faculty, it seems to me one of the places we need to integrate this is into our ecclesiology and how we understand the doctrine of the church. Not only how we view work in terms of the doctrine of creation, but how we view, quote, the ministry in terms of our ecclesiology. So it seems to me that our task here in sort of redismantling this hierarchy is to affirm that all legitimate work in the marketplace is an arena of service to Christ, and that the very work itself is part of that. And part of what I think is again, I think an implication or an assumption that's made that goes with this hierarchy is that we often assume that there's a connection, some sort of a connection between a person's spirituality or their spiritual commitment and the vocation that they choose. And that this hierarchy not only reflects callings that people view are more important to God's kingdom, but also that's viewed as a measuring stick of our spirituality. In fact, before coming to Talbot, I was with a parachurch organization that actually had as the top point of a person's discipleship was joining the staff of that organization. As though the determination of where you were going to get a paycheck from actually was some serious indicator of your level of spirituality. And now, of course, there are, as we said last time, there are certain occupations that are clearly outside the bounds on this. And so, yeah, maybe we could say that somebody who's committed to following Christ, will not be serving in some of these areas. But I think those are generally, pretty few and far between, and that the marketplace, as well as the pastorate and the mission field, all suffer from being under the general effects of sin, and all are flawed And even on the days when you feel like you found your niche and are functioning in the arenas that God has called you, you'll have days when you want to throw in the towel, and have days when it doesn't go so well. And I would really encourage us not to make any necessary connection between a person's vocation in the marketplace or in the pastorate, what they do for a living, and their general spirituality. Because it would seem to me that it would only take a cursory look at the number of pastors who have had career-wrecking moral failures to suggest that there is no necessary connection between spirituality and where you get a paycheck from. Some of the godliest people I know are people who have been slugging it out, trying to live out their faith in the marketplace or in the media or as journalists in some very, very challenging arenas. And the workplace, in my view, is one of the primary, if not the primary place in which God works out our spiritual formation. Because if you think that's where the people, you Talbot students who are heading for the pastorate, that's where most of the people you minister to spend the majority of their waking hours in the marketplace. And to assume that what happens, during an hour, 2-3 hours a week in the local church is a more formative place where God works out their spiritual formation, as opposed to 40, 50, 60 hours in the marketplace, that seems naive to me. And what goes on in the marketplace, God uses in very powerful ways to build in some very important virtues and to chip away a lot of rough edges of character. I mean, it seems to me that the marketplace person really understands what the virtue of service is about. Because try being a successful business person without that virtue of serving customers, serving employees, and serving your organization. The marketplace person, I think, gets what the virtue of perseverance and persistence is about. They get what it means to handle adversity. I mean, ask any business person who's had to lay off a good number of the employees who have been committed to that organization for a long time. And they understand that those virtues, the marketplace is a really significant place in which those virtues get built in. They are nurtured and, I think, required by our activity in the marketplace. So as we wrap this up, can we make a deal today? Can we stop talking about secular work as somehow being less holy than what goes on in the local church? Can we stop talking about full-time ministry as though that's something you go into when you decide where you're going to get a paycheck from? Can we stop talking about higher callings and talk more about the arenas that are the best fit for how God's wired you and what your passions are and what your sense of calling is from God? See, I think if we did that, just change the way we talked about this, I think that would make a significant difference in the lives of the marketplace people who are in our churches. And it would make a significant difference for those of you undergrads as you think about what is the arena of service that God's calling me to, and where you see accounting, and sales, and marketing, and filmmaking, and all of the occupations as potential arenas of service. Let me read it. I'll close with this. I was told not to go overtime today because donuts are waiting. This is a letter I got from one of my Talbot students about just a few months ago. Thank you very much, Dr. Ray. I wanted to tell you how liberating it was to be in class today. My parents were successful business owners who were doing very well in business, but they always felt guilty doing well in business because they believed that doing pastoral ministry and missionary ministry is the best thing that they should do. After a few short mission trips, they became missionaries to Mexico. They believed they should do full-time missionary work to do, quote, godly works. They sold all their businesses and became missionaries. I doubt that they are truly happy. They always tell me that they are happy that they are doing God's work and they believe pastoral ministry is a higher calling. And I think they are finally proud of me because I'm studying in seminary. She came from the marketplace. I think, she goes down, I think it was truly inspiring to know that I can pursue other things that might, quote, be worldly. But I think it was freeing to know that I can do other things in life besides be a missionary. Okay? Now again, that's not dinging the mission field or the pastorate. But it is liberating people to be able to discern the areas in which God's called them and to give expression to the areas of life that they are most passionate about. And that's really the goal, because I think in our churches we want the professional, the business, the marketplace folks to whom we minister, to whom we have charge over their lives, to get this right so that they don't grind away in the marketplace. And you undergrads, don't grind away thinking that if you're not a Bible major or not headed for seminary or for the pastorate, you're doing something that's not quite as good for God's kingdom. Theologically, that's not true. And my goal is for us to be able to affirm that, not only to our undergrad students, but you guys who are headed for the pastorate and the mission field, to affirm that to the people who are in the marketplace as well.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.